Ranger Daniel had walked the same trails in Yellowstone for over a decade. He knew the rhythm of the park. The chatter of birds at dawn, the rustling of small animals through the underbrush, the distant calls of wolves echoing off the ridges. But on that particular morning, as the sun painted the horizon orange, something was wrong. The forest was silent. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but a hollow, unnatural absence, as though the entire landscape was holding its breath. At first, he thought it might just be the weather. Sometimes storms could hush the woods before they rolled in. But the sky above was clear, and the air was crisp. He paused near a cluster of pines, straining to hear anything. A crow, a squirrel, even the whisper of wind through the branches. Nothing came. The silence pressed against his ears, thick and suffocating, until he found himself whispering out loud just to break it. Tourists hadn't noticed it right away. Families wandered the trails, snapping photos and laughing, their voices cutting sharply through the stillness. But Daniel watched the animals, or rather, the absence of them. The usual bison grazing near the meadow were gone. The elk herd that typically lingered by the riverbank had vanished. Even the insects seemed to have retreated, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made the park feel less alive, more like a painting frozen in time. Later that day, as the sun dipped lower, a pair of hikers approached Daniel at the ranger station. They mentioned feeling uneasy, though they couldn't explain why. One of them said, "It's like the forest is watching us." The comment sent a chill down Daniel's spine, because he had thought the same thing earlier, while patrolling the southern trails. Something about the silence felt intentional, as if the land itself had decided to mute its voice. That night, lying in his cabin, Daniel couldn't sleep. He replayed the day in his mind, remembering how the silence had stretched over the park like a heavy shroud. Yellowstone was alive, always breathing, always shifting, but now it felt dormant, waiting. And in that waiting, Daniel sensed something lurking just beyond comprehension. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise whenever he closed his eyes. The first tremor came so softly that most visitors mistook it for their imagination. A gentle ripple rolled through the soil, making coffee cups quiver on picnic tables and pebbles skitter across the trails. Ranger Daniel, however, felt it deep in his bones. He had grown accustomed to minor seismic activity in Yellowstone. It was, after all, one of the most geologically active places on Earth. But this didn't feel like the usual subterranean rattle. It was too shallow, too sharp, as if something enormous had shifted just below the thin crust of earth beneath their feet. Later that week, a group of hikers reported the ground moving under them while crossing a ridge near Norris Basin. One woman swore the earth rose slightly, like the surface of a giant creature taking a breath, before settling again. Her friends laughed nervously, but she couldn't shake the image. When Daniel went to investigate, he found disturbed soil patterns across the ridge, curving in shapes that didn't match the usual cracks caused by earthquakes. It looked almost deliberate, as though something was pushing upward from below. Tourists began whispering about it. Some complained of sudden dizziness, as though the ground itself pulsed beneath them. Children cried out, saying the earth wiggled when they ran across the open fields. Daniel tried to reassure visitors that the tremors were harmless, but deep down, he knew something was off. Unlike traditional quakes that rattled windows and sent loose rocks tumbling, These jolts came with no warning and vanished as quickly as they arrived, leaving behind only unsettled nerves. What unsettled him most was the frequency. By the third week, the tremors weren't rare occurrences, but daily phenomena. Sometimes they were strong enough to make trees creak in protest, their roots straining against the shifting soil. Daniel once placed his hand against the ground during a tremor and felt a vibration that wasn't chaotic like normal seismic waves. It was rhythmic, almost like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. He quickly withdrew his hand, unsettled by the thought. By evening, his logbook was filled with hastily scribbled notes. Shallow quake near Geyser Hill. Lasted 3 seconds. Vibrations felt uneven, localized. But the detail that haunted him most was one entry he wrote without even realizing it. It's moving closer. The first discovery was a lone elk, lying motionless beside a steaming hot spring. At first glance, visitors assumed it had drowned, but the body was untouched, no burns, no external wounds, no signs of a struggle. Ranger Daniel examined it closely and noticed the animal's eyes were wide open, frozen in a glassy stare of terror. A faint sulfuric odor clung to its fur, so strong that Daniel covered his mouth and nose with a handkerchief as he wrote his report. Within days, more carcasses appeared. A bison collapsed near Mud Volcano. Its massive body sprawled across the earth as though it had simply dropped mid-step. Then came a series of smaller animals, rabbits, foxes, even birds, that seemed to fall where they stood. None showed injuries. No blood, no predator marks. The eerie uniformity unsettled Daniel. It wasn't nature's cycle of death. It was something else, something invisible. Tourists grew uneasy as rumors spread. Some claimed the hot springs themselves were releasing toxic gas. Others whispered that the animals had sensed something humans couldn't. A child pointed at a lifeless deer near a geyser and asked her father, "Why did it look scared before it died?" The man had no answer, and neither did Daniel. But the question lingered in his mind all night. What disturbed him most was the pattern. The bodies weren't scattered randomly. They were appearing closer and closer to Yellowstone's geothermal hotspots, as if the springs and geysers were drawing them in. Rangers tested the water and soil, but results came back inconclusive. No abnormal levels of toxins, no new pathogens. Yet Daniel noticed how even the surviving animals avoided the areas, circling wide arcs around the steaming vents, refusing to drink from pools they once relied upon. By the end of the week, Daniel logged over a dozen unexplained deaths. Each entry in his notebook grew darker, more frantic. One line stood out in the dim light of his cabin that night. "The ground is claiming them before it claims us." Old Faithful had always been the park's heartbeat. Predictable, steady, a natural clock that never failed to amaze tourists. For decades, it erupted on schedule, almost to the minute. But one afternoon, Ranger Daniel stood among a crowd of visitors as Old Faithful broke its rhythm. It erupted 40 minutes earlier than expected, shooting a column of boiling water into the sky. Cheers erupted from the crowd. But Daniel didn't cheer. He frowned, checking his watch, writing down the time. Something was wrong. Hours later, the geyser erupted again, this time with barely any warning. Water blasted upward with such force that several tourists stumbled backward in shock. The eruption was louder than usual, deeper somehow, and when it ended, steam lingered in the air far longer than normal, hanging like a ghostly veil over the basin. Daniel stared at the cloud as it twisted unnaturally, curling into strange shapes before dispersing. He couldn't shake the sense that the geyser wasn't just releasing pressure. It was signaling something. Soon, reports came in from other rangers. Steamboat Geyser, which sometimes went years without activity, suddenly roared to life 3 times in a single week. Smaller, unnamed geysers began bubbling and spitting violently, sending sulfur, smelling mist across the trails. The air near the geothermal areas grew thicker, harder to breathe, leaving visitors coughing and rubbing their eyes. Daniel's log entries became increasingly urgent. Eruptions are no longer random. They're accelerating. Tourists began noticing it too. Videos flooded social media of geysers erupting unexpectedly, sometimes mere minutes apart, sometimes in bizarre sequences that looked like a chain reaction. One clip showed a geyser shooting water while, in the background, another erupted almost in response, as if the earth itself was communicating through boiling water and steam. Scientists tried to calm the panic, insisting geyser activity was unpredictable by nature. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't chaos. It was a pattern forming. One evening, Daniel walked the trails alone, his flashlight beam cutting across the steaming earth. He crouched near a smaller geyser that hadn't erupted in years, only to watch it bubble violently at his feet. The ground beneath him trembled with each burst, and for a moment, he thought he could hear something beneath the roar. A deep, guttural sound, almost like a growl rising from the depths. He stumbled back, the beam of his flashlight shaking, his notebook slipping from his grasp as he realized the geysers weren't just misbehaving. They were warning. The Miller family had checked into Yellowstone's northern campground on a quiet Friday evening. Neighbors recalled them roasting marshmallows, laughing, and telling stories by the fire. Nothing seemed unusual. Their campsite was neat, their gear well organized, and their 2 young children were seen chasing fireflies along the edge of the trees. But by morning, their spot was eerily deserted. The fire still smoldered, their tent was zipped shut from the inside, and their belongings were untouched. Wallets, phones, and even their shoes remained in place. Yet the Millers were gone. When rangers investigated, they expected to find tracks leading away from the site. But the ground told a different story. There were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest anyone had walked into the woods or toward the road. Instead, Daniel noticed something deeply unsettling. The soil near the tent bore circular impressions, faint but distinct, as though the earth itself had pulsed upward in perfect rings. They didn't match any animal tracks. They didn't match anything at all. Search teams spread out across the forest, combing miles of terrain with dogs and drones. The animals, however, refused to cooperate. Search dogs whimpered and pulled away from the hot spring basins, their hackles raised, as if terrified to get closer. The drones captured only hazy footage, streams of steam rising in thick waves that distorted the landscape, like the air itself was trying to hide something. The Millers' trail, if it existed at all, had been swallowed by the land. Word spread quickly among tourists, and soon rumors spiraled out of control. Some whispered that the Millers had stumbled into a hidden fissure that swallowed them whole. Others claimed they were taken by something beneath Yellowstone, the same force that had silenced the animals and stirred the geysers. Parents clutched their children closer, while visitors left the park in the middle of the night, unwilling to risk another vanishing. For the first time in years, The campground grew half empty. Daniel couldn't let go of one detail. The children's toys were found neatly placed inside the tent, as though someone, or something, had returned them there after the family was gone. He wrote in his logbook with trembling hands, no sign of struggle, no exit path. It's as if the earth itself opened and claimed them. By the time the Miller family's disappearance reached the national news, Yellowstone was already on edge. Tourists whispered about the dead animals, the trembling ground, and the unpredictable geysers. The Park Service tried to maintain order, releasing carefully worded statements about natural fluctuations. But Ranger Daniel knew those words were hollow. Every note in his logbook, every uneasy silence in the forest, every unexplained tremor painted a picture he could no longer ignore. Against his better judgment, he decided to break protocol. At the visitor center one evening, Daniel gathered a small crowd of hikers and campers who had come seeking answers. His voice, usually steady, carried a quiver of fear as he spoke. "Something is happening beneath Yellowstone," he began. "These aren't just random events. The park is changing, and it's not in ways we understand." Murmurs rippled through the room, but no one left. Everyone leaned in closer, drawn to the urgency in his tone. He recounted the silence that blanketed the forest, the animals that died without cause, the ground that pulsed beneath his boots. He spoke of geysers erupting like they were following some hidden rhythm, and the family that vanished without leaving a single footprint. "It's not just seismic activity," Daniel said, lowering his voice until it was barely above a whisper. "It feels alive." His words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dismiss. A man in the crowd laughed nervously, muttering about conspiracy theories, but the rest remained silent. Mothers held their children tighter, and several people exchanged worried glances. One woman raised her hand and asked the question that Daniel dreaded most. "If it's alive, what does it want?" Daniel didn't answer. His silence was more chilling than any response he could have given. That night, reports spread across the campground about what the ranger had said. Some people packed their bags immediately, leaving in the dead of night without waiting for morning light. Others stayed but couldn't sleep, staring at the dark horizon where columns of steam twisted into the sky. And Daniel, sitting alone in his cabin, scribbled one final warning in his notebook before blowing out his lantern. "The park doesn't want us here anymore." The first sign came in the sky. At dusk, as the last rays of sunlight faded, a strange crimson glow began to spread above Yellowstone. It wasn't the soft orange of sunset or the flicker of distant wildfires. It was darker, heavier, like the reflection of fire smoldering beneath the clouds. Visitors gathered along the boardwalks, phones raised, capturing shaky footage of the unnatural hue. The glow didn't fade with nightfall. Instead, it deepened, painting the horizon in blood, red shadows that made the steam rising from the ground look almost alive. Soon the air itself seemed to change. A low, humming vibration rolled across the park, not loud but impossible to ignore, rattling through bones and teeth like the echo of a subterranean engine. Tourists clapped their hands over their ears, swearing they could hear voices within the sound. Whispers carried on the wind, syllables that didn't belong to any human language. Daniel stood at the edge of the basin, staring at the steam as it thickened, coiling upward like smoke from something vast and unseen below. The geysers erupted without warning, not in sequence but in chaos, one after another, sending jets of water screaming into the night sky. Boiling spray rained down on the walkways, forcing tourists to scatter in panic. Steam clouds thickened into shapes that twisted in ways no wind should have shaped them, curling into spirals and jagged forms that seemed to hover, almost watching. Cameras captured the spectacle, but the recordings were corrupted, filled with static and distorted images, as though whatever was happening resisted being documented. Then came the ground, shaking roar. It wasn't the sharp jolt of an earthquake but a deep, rolling sound that seemed to rise from the Earth's core, stretching for miles in every direction. Trees shuddered, the lakes rippled violently, and animals fled in frantic herds, charging past terrified campers who could only stand frozen in awe and dread. For a fleeting moment, Daniel thought the ground beneath him swelled, as though something massive pressed upward, straining against the thin crust of earth that held it back. In the chaos, the park's power grid flickered once, twice, and then died completely. Lanterns and flashlights blinked on, scattering feeble beams through the fog. Radios crackled with static, but through the distortion, Daniel's voice broke in for one last transmission. His words, barely audible, cut across the silence like a blade. "It's starting." And as Ranger Daniel's final words faded into the static, the night over Yellowstone grew heavier, darker alive. The glow in the sky pulsed once more, as though answering his warning, and then silence. No birds, no footsteps, no whispers of wind. Just silence. To this day, no one knows what Yellowstone was trying to tell us that night. But those who were there swear they felt it, the ground breathing beneath their feet, waiting. And if Daniel was right, if the park itself is alive, then maybe, just maybe, it hasn't finished yet.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.